Two things have been happening for a very long time. Human beings have been thinking hard about how to live for roughly as long as anyone has kept a written record of it, emperors scribbling notes to themselves before dawn, an enslaved teacher building an entire philosophy out of what he could and could not control, a scholar doubting every truth he was ever taught until almost nothing was left standing, and at the same time, on a much smaller and much faster scale, you have been making the same kinds of decisions those people spent decades working out, usually in about 4 seconds, usually without noticing you were deciding anything at all. This episode sits 50 of history's sharpest minds down, one at a time, and asks what they actually figured out, not their trivia, not their dates. The lesson itself, the one Marcus Aurelius wrote in a tent between battles because no one was ever supposed to read it, the one a psychiatrist carried out of a concentration camp because it was the only thing left worth carrying. Some of these people were emperors. One lived in a jar. One was born enslaved and ended up teaching the children of senators. None of them were trying to write a self-help book. They were trying to survive their own century, and somewhere in the process, most of them worked out something that still holds. Settle in, there is no reason to rush through 50 ideas this old and this well tested. You have probably never kept a journal you expected an empire to read centuries later, and neither did Marcus Aurelius. He wrote his notes at night, often exhausted, often in a military tent somewhere near the edges of the empire he ruled, addressing no one but himself. Rome was fighting wars on multiple fronts. A plague was moving through his own household. None of that appears in his notes as complaint. It appears as material. The habit running through nearly every page is the same one. Whatever stands in the way of what you are trying to do becomes the very thing you work with next. A general blocks your path, so you learn command from watching him block it. A friend betrays you, so you learn something sharper about trust than you knew before. Marcus never framed this as optimism. He framed it as arithmetic. The obstacle was simply where the next move had to start from, so refusing to start there changed nothing except how long you waited. He wrote this without an audience in mind, which is easy to forget reading it now. There was no plan to publish, no reputation being managed, no line written for effect. That absence of performance is most of why the notes still land. A man with more power than almost anyone alive was quietly telling himself the same things any person mutters at 2 a.m, trying to hold steady. The notebook survived by accident more than design, passed down, copied, eventually printed, and titled by later editors something closer to himself than anything Marcus chose. He never learned it would outlive Rome. He was only trying to get through one more difficult year as calmly as he could manage. It is still just a man, talking to himself in the dark, refusing to let the obstacle be the end of the sentence. An oracle at Delphi once told a friend of Socrates that no man in Athens was wiser than him. Socrates found this baffling, since, by his own account, he considered himself to know essentially nothing of real importance. So he set out to test the oracle by finding someone smarter. He started with the politicians, since they spoke with the most confidence. Under a few simple questions, most of them collapsed, sure of their opinions, unable to defend where those opinions actually came from. He tried the poets next, then the craftsmen, who at least knew their own trade well, but assumed that competence in one thing made them wise about everything else. Slowly, an uncomfortable pattern took shape. Socrates was not wiser because he knew more. He was wiser because he was the only one willing to admit, out loud, how little he actually knew for certain. He later described his role in the city as something like a gadfly, a biting insect whose entire job was to keep a large, comfortable, slow-moving animal from settling into an easy, undisturbed sleep. This turned into a method more than a mood. Rather than lecture people toward conclusions, he asked question after question, letting people talk themselves into contradictions their own words had already set up. It is a slow, patient, occasionally maddening way to think, and it made him plenty of enemies among people who preferred not to examine their own certainty too closely. Athens eventually charged him with corrupting its youth and disrespecting its gods, and he was offered the chance to soften his approach in exchange for his life. He declined. An unexamined life, he told the jury, was not worth living for a human being, and he seemed to mean it literally enough to die rather than pretend otherwise. He left behind no books of his own. Everything we know comes from people who listened to him ask questions in the street, and somehow that turned out to be enough. There is a version of pain almost no one can avoid, an injury, a diagnosis, a door closed on purpose or by accident, An early Buddhist teaching calls this the first arrow, and it never pretends the first arrow can always be dodged. The second arrow is different. It is the one fired afterward, the replaying of the moment, the private argument about whose fault it was, the quiet decision that this pain now means something terrible about your life as a whole. The teaching's claim is precise and a little startling. The first arrow often cannot be avoided, but the second one is optional, even though nearly everyone fires it automatically, without noticing there was a choice at all. This is not a claim that suffering is imaginary, or that a person should simply choose to feel differently by force of will. It is narrower than that. It says the mind tends to add a second layer of pain on top of the first, resistance, story, judgment, and that layer is where most of the actual suffering ends up living. More than in the original event itself. Someone struck by hardship who stops there, without adding the second wound, has genuinely suffered less, in this account, than someone struck the same way who then spends months firing arrows at themselves about it. Separating the two is not easy, and the teaching never claims that it is. It only claims the distinction is real, and worth noticing the moment it starts to blur. Two people trip on the same loose stone in the same street. One curses once, notices the scraped knee, and moves on with the rest of the day mostly intact. The other keeps replaying the fall for hours afterward, adding a second injury made almost entirely of thought, embarrassment, blame, a conviction that the whole day is now ruined, layered on top of a scrape that had already stopped hurting by the time the replaying began. Both met the exact same first arrow. Only one of them fired a second. Pain arrives on its own schedule, uninvited. The second arrow always needs a hand to draw the bow. Epictetus spent his early years as another man's property, with no legal claim over his own body, and he became, afterward, one of the most influential philosophy teachers the Roman world produced, eventually instructing sons of senators in the very empire that had once permitted his enslavement. His entire philosophy narrows to one division, repeated so often it became the spine of everything else he taught. Some things are within our power, and almost everything else is not. Our judgments, our choices, our responses, these belong to us. Our body, our reputation, our possessions, other people's opinions of us, these do not, no matter how much they feel like ours. Confusing the two, he argued, is the source of nearly all unnecessary suffering, since a person who tries to control what was never controllable is fighting a battle already lost before it starts. It is tempting to hear this as detachment, a shrug at the world. It was not meant that way. Epictetus cared intensely about how a person acts, courage, honesty, patience with others, because those things sit squarely inside what is actually ours to govern. The indifference was reserved only for outcomes we cannot dictate. Whether we are praised or ignored, whether we get sick, whether fortune turns for or against us. He liked to say that everything has two handles, one by which it can be carried and one by which it cannot, and that the same event, a brother's insult, a master's cruelty, can be picked up by the handle that burns or the handle that does not, depending entirely on which one a person chooses to reach for. That a man who had lived through the total absence of control over his own life arrived at this particular distinction is not really a coincidence. He had already tested, the hard way, exactly where the boundary of his own power actually sat. Everything he taught afterward was simply him describing what he had already been forced to learn. Zeno of Citium was a merchant before he was a philosopher, and the shift happened by accident. A shipwreck near the coast of Athens took his entire cargo down with it, leaving him stranded in a foreign city with nothing left to sell. Wandering with little else to do, he stopped in a bookshop and heard someone reading aloud from an account of Socrates. Something in it caught him enough that he asked the shopkeeper, half joking, where he might find men who lived like that. As it happened, a well-known philosopher was walking past the shop at that exact moment, and the shopkeeper simply pointed. Zeno followed him. He never went back to trading. Within a few years he was teaching his own students under a public colonnade in Athens, the painted porch, from which his followers eventually took their name, Stoics, from the Greek word for that very porch. The philosophy he built there was suited, almost too neatly, to the disaster that had launched it. A way of thinking built for people whose circumstances had just been taken out of their hands, asking what was actually still theirs to control once everything external had been stripped away. Students reportedly grew large enough in number, drawn from merchants and nobles alike, that the porch itself became a fixture of the city's daily life for decades after Zeno's death, long after anyone remembered the specific cargo that had gone down with his ship. Zeno rarely spoke about the shipwreck as tragedy. By most accounts, he treated it, later in life, as the best thing that had ever happened to him, a piece of very bad luck that had shoved him, without asking, toward the one life that actually fit. He had lost a ship's worth of cargo and ended up founding a school of thought, still read more than 2,000 years later. Sometimes the ruin is not the end of the story. Sometimes it is the only reason a story is left to tell. Diogenes of Sinope is remembered, among other things, for living in a large ceramic jar in the middle of Athens, by his own choice, having concluded that most of what people spend their lives accumulating was never actually necessary. He owned, depending on which account you trust, a cloak, a stick, and a cup, and reportedly threw the cup away after watching a boy drink from his own cupped hands, deciding the boy had just proven the cup unnecessary too. This was not poverty forced upon him. It was closer to a public experiment, testing in front of an entire city exactly how little a human being actually requires to get through a day. His most famous encounter puts the point sharply. Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the known world at the time, came to see him and offered to grant him anything he wished. Diogenes, sitting in a patch of sunlight, asked only that Alexander step aside, since he was blocking the light. Alexander reportedly walked away saying that if he were not Alexander, he would wish to be Diogenes, struck, it seems, by meeting the one man in his empire who wanted nothing at all from him. Diogenes' method was rarely gentle. He mocked pretension openly and generally treated social convention as something to test rather than obey. Underneath the provocation sat a genuinely serious claim that most anxiety comes not from having too little, but from believing you need far more than you actually do. He is also said to have walked through crowded daylight streets carrying a lit lamp, telling anyone who asked that he was simply looking for one honest man, a performance calculated to embarrass a city that considered itself thoroughly civilized. He died, by most accounts, an old man, still owning almost nothing, having spent a lifetime demonstrating that the emptiness people fear turns out, up close, to weigh almost nothing at all. Confucius spent much of his life trying, and largely failing, to get a ruler to actually hire him. He wandered from state to state during a period of near-constant warfare in ancient China, offering a theory of government that most rulers found, at the time, mildly inconvenient. His argument was this: a ruler who governs purely through law and punishment will be obeyed, but only out of fear and only for as long as enforcement is watching. A ruler who governs through personal virtue, through visible fairness, restraint, and consistency, earns something closer to genuine loyalty, the kind that holds even when no one is checking. Laws catch people after they have already decided to misbehave. Virtue, in his account, shapes what people want to do before punishment ever enters the picture. He tested the idea at the smallest scale first, in how a household runs. A family held together by a parent's quiet consistency, he argued, needs no written rules at all, while a family run purely through threats produces children who obey only when watched. Confucius believed the exact same logic scaled upward, household to village to state, without changing its basic shape. He also insisted that titles and duties had to actually match reality. A ruler called wise had to govern wisely. A son called dutiful had to actually behave dutifully, since a society that let its words drift away from its actions, in his account, was already halfway to disorder even before any law was broken. Few rulers in his lifetime were willing to govern by patience and personal example rather than by decree, and Confucius died largely unrecognized by the political system he had spent decades trying to reach. It was his students, compiling his sayings afterward into what became the Analects, who carried the idea forward long enough for entire dynasties to eventually govern by something close to it. The lesson outlived the rejection. It usually does. The Tao Te Ching spends surprisingly little time on abstract argument. Instead, it returns, again and again, to a single, almost childishly simple image: water. Water is, by any obvious measure, the weakest material available. It has no fixed shape. It cannot be gripped, cannot hold an edge, offers no resistance when you push against it, and yet, given enough time, water carves canyons through solid stone, wears mountains down to gravel, and finds its way through cracks no army could force open. Nothing yields more completely, and nothing, in the end, proves harder to stop. Lao Tzu built an entire philosophy of action around this one contradiction, often translated as effortless action, not laziness, but a kind of strength that works with the shape of things rather than smashing directly into them. A rigid branch snaps in a storm, a supple one bends and survives, having offered the wind nothing solid to break. The lesson, stripped of its poetry, is fairly practical. The thing that looks softest in a room is often the thing that outlasts everything hard in it. The text extends the same logic to leadership itself, arguing that the best ruler is one whose people barely notice being ruled at all, someone who governs the way water settles into the lowest, least glamorous places, without ever announcing that it has done so. A ruler constantly visible, constantly asserting control, is in this account already showing the strain of a grip too tight to last. This ran directly against the instincts of the era Lo Desiuch is said to have lived in, a time of warring states that prized visible strength, decisive force, and rigid hierarchy. His answer, delivered almost entirely through natural images rather than direct argument, suggested that visible force is frequently the least durable kind there is, and that real power often looks, from the outside, like barely any effort at all. 2,500 years later, people still quote the water. Stone, notably, has not made the same comeback. Aristotle noticed something that should have been obvious and mostly was not. Knowing what courage is does not make a person courageous, in exactly the same way that knowing the rules of music theory does not make someone able to play an instrument. Virtue, in his account, is not a fact you learn and then simply possess. It is closer to a skill, built the same slow way any skill is built, through repeated practice, mistakes, correction, and more repetition, until the action that once felt effortful starts to feel natural. A person becomes brave by repeatedly doing brave things, not by reading a convincing definition of bravery and nodding along. The habit comes first. The trait follows, sometimes years later, once the habit has worn a groove deep enough to hold. This is why Aristotle placed so much weight on what a person actually does, day after day, rather than on what they believe about themselves in the abstract. Someone who intends to be generous but never actually gives anything away has not built the trait of generosity, no matter how sincere the intention feels privately. The intention without the repeated action is, in his framing, close to nothing at all. Aristotle also argued that most virtues sit at a kind of midpoint between two failures, courage sitting between cowardice and recklessness, generosity between stinginess and waste, and that finding this midpoint reliably takes practiced judgment rather than a fixed formula, since the right amount of caution for one person in one situation can be cowardice for another person in a different one. He extended the same logic to a whole life, arguing that a good life is not one grand decision made once, but a long accumulation of smaller ones, repeated often enough that they stop requiring effort and start requiring only maintenance. There is no shortcut in his account, no clever insight that skips the practice. You are, by his measure, mostly just whatever you have kept doing long enough to stop noticing you were doing it. In Plato's most famous image, a group of prisoners has spent their entire lives chained inside a cave, facing a blank wall, watching shadows cast by a fire behind them. As far as they know, those shadows are the whole of reality, since they have genuinely never seen anything else. One prisoner is eventually freed and dragged painfully out into the sunlight. At first it is only agony. His eyes were built for shadow, not for actual light, and the adjustment is slow and disorienting rather than instantly clarifying. Slowly, though, he starts to make out real objects, and eventually the sun itself, and he understands, for the first time, how small and distorted the shadows on the wall really were compared to what they were shadows of. The sun itself, in Plato's account, stands for the highest and most difficult idea a mind can reach, the form of the good, something that takes a slow, effortful climb to see clearly and cannot simply be pointed at from inside the cave. Plato's real twist is not the escape. It is what happens when the freed prisoner goes back down into the cave to tell the others. His eyes, now adjusted to daylight, fumble in the dark. He stumbles, misjudges distances, seems clumsier than the people who never left, and when he tries to describe what he has seen, they do not believe him. Some, in Plato's account, would rather silence the messenger than reconsider the shadows they have always trusted. The allegory was Plato's argument for a deeper layer of reality behind ordinary appearances, reachable only through hard philosophical work, but it also works as a plainer observation about how new understanding tends to be received. The person returning with something true often looks, at first, less credible than the people who never left the cave at all. Being right early has rarely been a comfortable place to stand. Essis Uro wrote an entire treatise on friendship not long after losing one of the closest friends of his own life, and the grief shows through even in how carefully argued the book is. His claim, stated plainly, is that a true friend is another self, someone with whom a person can be as honest as with their own private thoughts. He drew a hard line between two kinds of friendship. One is built on usefulness, on what each person can offer the other, and it tends to dissolve the moment the usefulness runs out. The other is built on shared character, on genuinely valuing who the other person is rather than what they provide, and Cicero argued that only this second kind actually survives hardship, distance, or disagreement. This was not an abstract point for him. He had spent decades in Roman politics, a world built almost entirely on alliances of convenience, favors traded, support given only as long as it served someone's ambition. Watching those alliances evaporate the moment they stopped being useful seems to have sharpened his sense of what real friendship required by contrast. He also drew a careful line between a friend and a flatterer, warning that the easiest way to lose a real friendship is to surround yourself with people who only ever agree, since flattery feels pleasant in the moment and costs a person the one thing friendship is actually supposed to provide, an honest outside view of themselves. A true friend, in his account, functions less like a comfort and more like a second conscience, someone whose honest opinion is worth actively seeking out rather than avoiding. Cicero considered this rare enough that a person might only encounter a handful of such friendships across an entire life. And he thought that was fine. The point was never to collect many. It was to recognize the real ones when they appeared, and to be worth that kind of honesty in return. He wrote the whole book by his own account, mostly to keep the memory of one friendship intact a little longer. Epicurus founded a school of philosophy built entirely around the pursuit of pleasure, which makes it a little ironic how modestly he actually lived. His household ran on bread, water, and the company of a small circle of friends, and he seemed to consider that more than sufficient. His central argument cuts against what the word now suggests. Chasing bigger and bigger sensations, he claimed, tends to produce more anxiety over time, not less, since each new pleasure needs to be maintained, protected, and eventually replaced once it stops feeling new. The deepest and most durable pleasure available to a person, in his account, is not intensity at all. It is the simple absence of pain and disturbance, a calm, undisturbed mind that is not constantly chasing its next fix. He organized his followers into a community outside the city, deliberately away from the political ambition and status competition that consumed most of Athens, on the theory that much of human anxiety comes from comparison and striving rather than from any real material lack. Friendship mattered enormously to him, more than wealth or reputation, since he considered a trustworthy circle of people one of the few genuinely reliable sources of a stable, contented life. His community, known afterwards simply as the Garden, was unusual for its era in who it admitted. Women and enslaved people studied there alongside free men, on the reasoning that the capacity for a calm, undisturbed mind was not something limited to any particular social rank. None of this survived intact in how his name gets used today. An Epicurean meal in common speech means indulgence, richness, excess, almost the exact opposite of what Epicurus actually recommended. He would likely have found the modern use of his own name a little baffling, watching people chase the very excess he spent his life quietly arguing against. The philosophy of pleasure, it turns out, mostly argued for wanting less, not more. The art of war makes a claim that sounds almost too simple to be useful. A commander who knows both himself and his opponent can fight 100 battles without disaster, while a commander who knows neither is certain to lose everyone. Sun Tzu was not primarily interested in weapons, formations, or brute force. His text keeps circling back to information and to the uncomfortable gap between what a commander assumes to be true and what is actually true on the ground. Most defeats, in his account, are decided long before any fighting begins, in exactly that gap. Knowing the enemy is the half most commanders instinctively pursue, scouting terrain, counting troops, studying past campaigns. Knowing yourself is the harder half, and the one far more often skipped. It requires an honest accounting of your own army's exhaustion, your own supply lines, your own blind spots and overconfidence, the kind of self-assessment that flatters no one and is easy to avoid entirely. Sun Tzu treated self-knowledge as a discipline rather than a mood, something to be actively investigated rather than assumed. The text also insists that the very best outcome in any conflict is winning without fighting at all, subduing an opponent through positioning, timing, and preparation so thoroughly that the actual battle becomes unnecessary, a conclusion that only becomes visible once a commander has stopped overestimating both sides and started measuring them honestly. A commander who overestimates his own strength in his framing is often more dangerous to his own army than an enemy who correctly estimates it. The text has outlived its original battlefields by well over 2,000 years, precisely because the underlying claim was never really about war. It was about the cost of walking into anything, a rivalry, a negotiation, a difficult decision, without first being honest about where you actually stand. Seneca recommended a daily exercise that sounds on first hearing almost masochistic. Sit down and imagine, in specific and unflinching detail, every misfortune that could plausibly happen to you, not to feel worse, so that if any of it actually arrived, it would no longer feel unfamiliar. He called this a kind of rehearsal. Exile, poverty, the death of someone close, the collapse of a reputation built over decades, each one walked through deliberately in the mind ahead of time, so that fortune's actual arrival carries less shock when it eventually comes, and it always eventually comes. The purpose was never to dwell in dread. It was to take away fear's favorite weapon, which is surprise, the particular helplessness of being caught completely unprepared. Seneca had reason to take this seriously beyond theory. He lived for years under the threat of execution by an emperor who eventually did order his death, and he had already survived an earlier exile that stripped him of position and home with almost no warning. A person who has rehearsed disaster in the mind, calmly, repeatedly, tends to meet the real version of it with something closer to recognition than panic, since the shape of the loss is no longer entirely new. He recommended the exercise be specific rather than vague, naming the actual person who might be lost, the actual position that might be stripped away, on the theory that a fear left blurry keeps its full power, while a fear examined in close, concrete detail tends to shrink down to something a person can actually look at directly. This is easy to mistake for pessimism, expecting the worst as a kind of self-protection through low expectations. Seneca's version is more precise than that. He was not predicting catastrophe. He was refusing to be blindsided by the ordinary fact that catastrophe, sooner or later, visits everyone. Rehearsing it changes nothing about whether it comes. It changes everything about how ready you are standing there when it finally does. Marcus Aurelius' reputation for cold calculation tends to overshadow a quieter, more practical argument buried in the same book. He compared fortune to a violent river, one that floods without warning and can wash away everything in its path, and argued that a wise ruler builds the dikes and channels before the water ever rises, while the season is still calm. His estimate was that fortune governs roughly half of what happens to any person or any state. The other half, he insisted, remains genuinely within human control, provided the preparation is done early enough. Rulers who fail, in his account, usually fail not because luck simply turned against them, but because they never built anything sturdy enough to survive a turn. Everyone should have expected eventually. He pushed the river image further, noting that the very same flood that destroys one town leaves the next one untouched, simply because someone, earlier and less dramatically, had already spent the calm season reinforcing its banks, work that draws no praise at all until the water actually rises. This reframes the caricature people often carry of Marcus Aurelius, the cynic who believed the ends justify any means. Read past the more provocative lines, and what remains is closer to an engineer's argument. Fortune is not a moral force rewarding virtue or punishing vice. It is closer to weather, indifferent and eventually inevitable, and the only real defense against weather is infrastructure built ahead of time. He wrote this from bitter personal experience, having been imprisoned and stripped of political influence after a change in power he had not adequately prepared for. The book itself was among other things, an attempt to win back a position at court by demonstrating exactly the kind of foresight he was now recommending to others. Fortune had already flooded his own life once. He spent the rest of it explaining, carefully, how the dikes should have been built. Ibn Khaldun spent much of his career serving, advising, and occasionally fleeing the courts of various North African rulers, watching one dynasty after another rise quickly, and then just as reliably come apart. Eventually he stepped back from politics long enough to ask why the pattern kept repeating with such stubborn consistency. His answer centered on a bond he called asabiya, a kind of group solidarity strongest among people who genuinely need one another to survive. Tribes and small communities bound by mutual dependence and shared hardship. This bond, he argued, is precisely what allows a small, disciplined group to conquer and unify a much larger, wealthier territory. The trouble starts afterward. Once that same group settles into the comfort and luxury their conquest provided, the solidarity that built their power begins to loosen, generation by generation, replaced gradually by rivalry, indulgence, and a kind of complacency comfort tends to breed. By the time a dynasty reaches its most refined, prosperous phase, in his account, it has usually already lost the very quality that made its rise possible in the first place. leaving it vulnerable to a newer, hungrier group repeating the same cycle from the outside. He estimated this entire arc, rise, consolidation, comfort, collapse, tended to play out across roughly 3 or 4 generations, long enough that the grandchildren of the original conquerors could genuinely believe the comfort they inherited was simply how things had always been. Ibn Khaldun treated this less as moral decline and more as a structural pattern, closer to a law of social physics than a lesson in ethics. Writing centuries before sociology existed as a discipline, he built this theory almost entirely from direct observation and his own experience serving rulers whose confidence rarely matched how fragile their position actually was. Empires, in his account, are rarely destroyed outright. They mostly just get comfortable, and comfort, given enough time, does the rest of the work on its own. Al-Ghazali had, by his late 30s, reached one of the most prestigious teaching posts available in the Islamic world, respected as an authority on law, logic, and theology. And then, almost without warning, he found he could no longer simply trust any of it. The doubt was not casual. By his own account, it grew severe enough to affect his ability to speak, eat, or teach with any confidence, since he could no longer be certain that the arguments he was presenting to students rested on anything more solid than habit and inherited assumption. Rather than push the doubt aside and continue performing certainty he no longer felt, he walked away from his post in Baghdad entirely, leaving behind reputation, income, and position to spend years traveling and searching, largely alone. He tested one form of knowledge after another during this period: formal logic, theological argument, the mystical practices of Islamic Sufism, treating each one as a claim to be investigated rather than simply accepted on authority. What he was looking for was not comfort. It was a kind of certainty he could actually stand behind, built from his own examination, rather than borrowed wholesale from teachers he could no longer be sure had examined it properly themselves. He described the crisis, years later, as a sickness whose cure could not be a medicine of arguments and words alone, since the doubt had settled somewhere deeper than logic could reach, and only years of direct, lived searching were able to work it loose. He eventually returned to teaching, having arrived at a faith he considered genuinely his own rather than inherited. The years of unresolved doubt were not, in his later account, a detour from the real search. They were the search itself, the uncomfortable middle stretch nearly every serious question passes through before anything solid enough to hold on to emerges on the other side. Hypatia taught mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy openly in Alexandria, at a time when the city was splitting into increasingly violent religious and political factions, each one certain the other represented an existential threat. She was, by nearly every surviving account, an unusually respected figure, drawing students from across those same factions to study geometry and Neoplatonist philosophy under her instruction. Her position seems to have been genuinely above the fighting, at least for a time, valued by governors and scholars alike, regardless of which faction they belonged to. That neutrality, which might have seemed like protection, turned out to offer none at all once tensions escalated far enough. She was killed by a mob, in a killing later writers described as tied directly to the political rivalries she had never actually taken part in. Her death became, centuries later, a kind of cautionary symbol, less about any specific belief she held, and more about the danger a visible, respected intellectual life can face once it gets pulled into a conflict it never chose to enter. Being useful to every side, it turns out, is not the same as being safe from any of them. Students traveled to study under her specifically, drawn by a reputation for rigor that seems to have crossed religious lines more easily than almost anything else in the city at the time, at least until the factional violence around her grew too large for any single reputation to hold back. What survives of her actual scholarship, commentaries on earlier mathematical and astronomical texts, suggests a rigorous, careful mind operating at the edge of what her era understood about the stars and about number itself. Alexandria lost in her one of its sharpest working scholars, at a moment when the city could least afford to lose anyone still capable of speaking calmly across the lines everyone else had already drawn. Boethius wrote his most influential book while imprisoned and awaiting execution on a charge of treason he denied to the very end, with no real expectation the verdict would be reversed. Rather than spend his final months in despair or denial, he composed a dialogue between himself and a figure he called Philosophy, personified as a woman who visits him in his cell to work through, calmly and systematically, why a life built carefully around virtue can still end in ruin through no evident fault of the person living it. The book's central image is a wheel, turned by a figure called Fortune, lifting some people up and casting others down with no regard for merit or effort. Anything Fortune grants in this account was never truly a possession to begin with, only a loan, subject to recall at any moment without notice or explanation. Philosophy, in the dialogue, does not promise Boeus his life back, or even much sympathy. She offers instead a kind of clear-eyed accounting, reminding him which parts of what he lost were ever really his to begin with, and which parts, character, judgment, the capacity for reason itself, Fortune's wheel had never actually been able to touch. This was not written as detached theory. Bowie the Us had held real power, serving at the highest levels of government before an accusation stripped it all away in what seems, by most modern readings, to have been a largely unjust process. Facing death without the option of appeal, he chose to spend his remaining time working through the hardest possible version of the question: whether reason and virtue retain any value once fortune has taken everything else a person built a life around. The book became one of the most read and translated works of the entire Middle Ages, copied and studied for 1,000 years afterward, composed by a man who had every reason to write something bitter, and instead wrote something closer to steady. Abel Augustine of Hippo opened his own autobiography with a line that has been quoted for more than 1,600 years since, that the human heart remains restless until it finds rest. He wrote this as a bishop looking back on a much less settled youth, one that included ambition, a long relationship he never formalized, years spent chasing status and philosophical fashions he later considered hollow, and a mother who prayed, by his account, for decades before his eventual conversion. Rather than smooth over that earlier life for the sake of a tidier reputation, he examined it in unusual detail, treating his own memories, failures, and half-understood motives as material worth studying honestly, rather than material to be quietly edited out. The book is often credited as one of the first sustained works of Western autobiography, built almost entirely around the premise that understanding yourself requires telling the truth about where you have actually been, including the parts that reflect badly on you. Augustine seemed to believe that skipping the uncomfortable parts would have undermined the entire project, since the restlessness he was describing only made sense once the reader saw exactly what he had been restless for. He devotes an entire oddly memorable passage to stealing pears as a teenager, not because the theft itself mattered much, the pears were mediocre and he barely wanted them, but because he wanted to understand why he had done something wrong, purely for the thrill of doing it alongside friends, a small ordinary act he kept returning to as a clue about something larger in his own motivation. The interior stillness he eventually describes finding did not arrive quickly, and he never presents it as a single dramatic turn, so much as the end of a long wandering search that takes most of his adult life. The heart in his account keeps moving until it finds the one thing that finally lets it stop. Thomas Ukwy structured his life's major work as a long sequence of questions, and his method for answering each one was unusual for the time. He began by stating the strongest possible objections to his own eventual conclusion, often several of them, argued as forcefully as their original authors would have argued them. Only after laying out those objections in full did he offer his own answer, and then went back point by point to respond to each one individually, rather than simply dismissing them in passing. This meant that by the time a reader reached his conclusion, the toughest counter-arguments had already been named, taken seriously, and addressed directly, not avoided or quietly ignored. He was working on one of the largest intellectual projects of the medieval period, trying to reconcile Christian theology with the philosophy of Aristotle, which had only recently become widely available in Latin translation, and which many of his contemporaries considered dangerous, precisely because its logic was so difficult to refute. Aquinas' response was not to ban the difficult questions Aristotle raised. It was to sit with them longer than anyone else was willing to, and answer them properly rather than around. Each individual question in his major work follows the identical structure: objections first, then a brief statement of his own position, then a point-by-point reply, repeated with the same discipline, whether the subject was the nature of God or something as ordinary as whether it is permissible to tell a lie to save a life. The discipline required real patience. It is considerably harder to state your opponent's case, as well as they would state it themselves, than it is to summarize a weaker version and knock that down instead. Aquinas did the harder version thousands of times across tens of thousands of pages, and the durability of his conclusions owes a great deal to the fact that they had already survived their toughest opposition before anyone else even got to read them. Erasmus wrote an entire book delivered in the voice of Folly herself, a personified figure who praises her own foolishness at length, cheerfully, without ever once pausing to notice how much of what she describes matches the actual behavior of Erasmus' own era. The corruption he wanted to target, rigid dogma, self-important scholars, clergy more interested in status than substance, was dangerous to criticize directly in the political and religious climate he was writing in. So he let Folly say the quiet part loudly and proudly, praising exactly the habits Erasmus considered most absurd, until the absurdity became obvious to anyone reading closely, without a single direct accusation ever being made. The gentleness of the method was itself part of the argument. A joke delivered with a smile tends to land somewhere a direct accusation never reaches, since the reader arrives at the criticism themselves rather than being told what to think. People who might have bristled at a lecture found themselves laughing along with Folly's praise, only to realize partway through exactly whose habits were being described. Folly even praises scholars who argue endlessly over questions no one outside their own circle could possibly care about, a jab Erasmus aimed squarely at academic culture he considered lost in its own cleverness, while the actual moral condition of ordinary people went largely unaddressed. Erasmus moved in the highest intellectual circles of his time, corresponding with kings, popes, and scholars across the continent, and he seemed to understand instinctively that mockery, used carefully, could reach places a sermon never would. Wit was not, for him, a lesser tool than direct argument. It was simply the sharper one, precisely because it slipped past the defenses a direct challenge would immediately trigger. Folly, it turned out, was the safest and most effective voice from which to tell an entire era some uncomfortable truths about itself. Michel de Montaigne is widely credited with inventing an entire literary form, the essay, simply by trying to write down an honest account of his own wandering thoughts, without forcing them into the shape of a formal argument. He had retired from public life to a tower on his family's estate, and what he produced there did not resemble the philosophy of his era, which tended to argue confidently toward fixed conclusions. Montaigne's writing doubled back on itself, contradicted earlier pages, admitted confusion in plain view, and rarely arrived anywhere resembling a tidy final answer. His guiding question, "What do I actually know?" was less a rhetorical flourish than a genuine operating principle, one he applied relentlessly to his own opinions as much as to anyone else's. This candor was unusual for the time. Writers were expected to project authority, not uncertainty, and Montaigne's willingness to describe his own contradictions, his changing moods, even his own bodily discomforts, struck many readers as strange at first and then, gradually, as something closer to honest than anything they had read before. He treated his own mind as worth examining precisely because it was ordinary, reasoning that if he could describe his own confusion accurately enough, other people would likely recognize a version of their own thinking in it. He wrote about his kidney stones, his cat, his fear of death, and his own changing opinions with roughly equal seriousness, refusing the era's usual instinct to treat only grand subjects as worthy of grand attention, on the theory that an honest small observation often taught more than a borrowed large one. The form he stumbled into, short, personal, exploratory, unresolved, became one of the most durable literary inventions to come out of the period, still used today by writers working through an idea in real time, rather than presenting one already settled. Montaigne never claimed to have found many answers. He mostly just got remarkably honest about not having them yet. Long before psychology existed as a field, Francis Bacon sat down and catalogued the specific mental habits that quietly distort human judgment, giving each one its own name so it could actually be discussed and guarded against. He called these distortions idols, borrowing a word usually reserved for false gods, since he considered these mental habits every bit as capable of leading a mind astray. Some came from human nature generally, a tendency to notice evidence that confirms what we already believe, and quietly discount evidence that does not. Others came from an individual's own particular temperament and upbringing, shaping what a specific person is inclined to notice or ignore. Still others came from the slipperiness of language itself, and from an uncritical deference to old authorities and inherited tradition simply because they were old. Bacon's larger argument was that real knowledge could not be built by simply trusting these instincts, or by repeating what earlier scholars had claimed without testing it directly. It had to be built through careful, repeated observation of the world itself, checked and rechecked against what actually happens, rather than what tradition assumed must be true. This put him at odds with a great deal of the scholarship of his era, which still leaned heavily on ancient authority as its own form of proof. He compared the honest scientific mind to a bee, gathering material from the actual world and transforming it through careful work, rather than to a spider, which spins an elaborate structure entirely out of itself, mistaking the intricacy of its own reasoning for evidence about anything real. A lawyer and statesman by profession, Bacon ended up mapping the mind's own blind spots with a precision that would not be formally revisited by psychology for centuries. He never ran a controlled experiment on human bias himself. He simply watched people think, carefully enough, and wrote down what he saw. René Descartes decided to doubt every belief he held, one at a time, including the existence of the physical world around him, to see whether anything at all would survive being questioned that thoroughly. He was not trying to become a skeptic for its own sake. He was trying to find a single foundation solid enough that no amount of doubt could shake it, and then rebuild the rest of human knowledge carefully on top of that one certain point, rather than continuing to build on assumptions that had never actually been tested. Senses can deceive us, he reasoned, so they could not be trusted completely. Even mathematics, which felt certain, could in principle be the product of some elaborate deception he had no way of ruling out. What finally survived this process was not a fact about the outside world at all. It was the act of doubting itself. Whatever else might be an illusion, the fact that a thinking process was actively happening seemed undeniable even in the middle of doubting everything else, since doubting is itself a form of thinking. From that single narrow foothold, he began building outward again, more carefully this time. He reportedly developed much of this method not at a university desk, but during long solitary stretches spent thinking beside a stove in a rented room, treating philosophy less as a body of inherited texts to master, and more as a set of tools he had to build for himself from scratch, since he trusted almost nothing he had simply been taught. The method was radical for its era, treating even the most obvious-seeming assumptions as suspects rather than starting points. Descartes was not trying to make people cynical about the world. He was trying to show that certainty, if it exists at all, has to be earned through this kind of deliberate clearing out, rather than simply inherited from whatever a person happened to be taught as a child. Blaise Pascal, a mathematician who helped invent the mathematics of probability, argued that every person is already making a kind of bet about the nature of existence, whether or not they ever consciously decide to place one. His wager is usually remembered narrowly, as an argument about religious belief specifically, but underneath it sits a broader observation about living with genuine uncertainty. People act every single day without complete information, and even refusing to decide is itself a decision carrying its own consequences. There is no neutral option that avoids the bet entirely, only different ways of placing it, consciously or not. Pascal described the human condition as suspended uncomfortably between two infinities, too small to fully grasp the vastness stretching out above us, and too enormous, relative to the truly minuscule, to grasp the smallness stretching out below. A person, in his famous phrase, is a thinking reed, fragile enough to be destroyed by a puff of wind or a drop of water, and yet capable, through thought alone, of understanding the very forces that could destroy it. That capacity for understanding, however limited, was for Pascal the entire dignity of being human. Even a puff of vapor or a single drop of water could destroy the thinking reed entirely, and yet the reed, in the very moment of being destroyed, would still know that it was dying, a form of awareness Pascal considered greater than anything possessed by the vast, indifferent universe capable of crushing it without ever noticing it had done so. He lived a short, physically fragile, restless life, moving between serious mathematical work and long stretches of religious searching, and he seemed to carry this suspended uncertainty personally, rather than merely describing it from a comfortable distance. The wager he is remembered for was less a clever trick than an honest description of a bet he felt every person was already quietly making. Baruch Spinoza was formally expelled from his own Jewish community in Amsterdam over his philosophical views, a rare and severe punishment that cut him off from nearly everyone he had grown up around. He spent the rest of his life building a philosophy in which everything that happens, including human thought, emotion, and choice, follows necessarily from prior causes, in much the same way a geometric proof follows necessarily from its starting axioms. There was, in his account, no exception carved out for human freedom in the way people ordinarily imagine it, no uncaused choices floating free of everything that came before them. Rather than finding this bleak, Spinoza argued the opposite. Clearly understanding why we feel and act as we do, tracing our emotions back to their actual causes instead of being blindly pushed around by them without insight, was itself a form of genuine freedom, maybe the only kind actually available to a person. A person ruled by emotions they do not understand is not free in any meaningful sense, in his account, even if those emotions feel entirely spontaneous in the moment. A person who understands the causes behind those emotions gains something closer to real command over their own life, even within a fully determined system. He built his major philosophical work, The Ethics, in the strict geometric style of a mathematics textbook, definitions, axioms, and propositions proved in sequence, insisting that a subject as slippery as human emotion could still be reasoned about with the same discipline a mathematician brings to a triangle. He supported himself modestly afterward by grinding optical lenses, avoiding wealth and public position, and continued refining this philosophy largely alone, cut off from the community that had once been his entire social world. Exclusion, in his case, did not soften his thinking into something safer. It pushed him toward one of philosophy's most demanding and least comforting versions of what freedom actually means. John Locke argued that the human mind begins as a blank slate, with nothing written on it at birth, and that every idea a person ever holds gets built afterward from experience alone. If nothing is fixed in a person from the start, Locke reasoned, then character, belief, and even prejudice are shaped overwhelmingly by upbringing, environment, and experience, rather than by any claimed natural destiny a person was simply born into. A child raised in dramatically different circumstances, in his account, would become a genuinely different person, not because their underlying nature changed, but because there was no fixed underlying nature dictating the outcome in the first place. He carried this same logic directly into political theory, where it became considerably more disruptive. If people are not born already marked as rulers or subjects, superior or inferior, by some fixed natural order, then no government can claim legitimacy simply by inheritance or divine appointment. Locke argued instead that legitimate authority rests on the consent of the people being governed, an agreement that can, in principle, be withdrawn if that government stops serving the people who granted it. Locke extended the same reasoning to property and to a person's basic rights, arguing that these existed prior to government entirely, and that government's whole job was to protect what people already possessed, rather than to hand down permissions from above. Like gifts it could just as easily take back. This was a considerably more dangerous claim in his era than it sounds today, arriving at a moment when most European governments still rested their authority on claims of birthright and divine will. An idea about the emptiness of the newborn mind, followed carefully to its logical end, became one of the sturdier arguments for the idea that political power has to be earned and kept, not simply inherited. David H. Hume noticed something strange buried inside how most moral arguments are actually built. They tend to slide, almost without anyone noticing the seam, from describing what is the case to declaring what ought to be done, as though the second simply followed automatically from the first. His point was that it does not, at least not through logic alone. No amount of purely factual description, however detailed and accurate, can by itself generate an obligation, a should, without some further ingredient smuggled in along the way. That further ingredient, in Hume's account, is feeling. Moral judgments, he argued, are not conclusions reached by cool, detached reasoning, the way a geometry proof is reached. They are closer to responses, rooted in sentiment, in what a person finds approval or revulsion in the moment, with reason arriving mostly afterward to explain a verdict feeling had already delivered. This was a considerably more modest role for reason than most philosophers before him had assigned it. Hume described reason as, in his own memorable phrase, the servant of the passions, useful for figuring out how to get what we want, but incapable on its own of telling us what to want in the first place. Cold logic could tell you the most efficient way to reach a goal. It could never, by itself, tell you which goal was worth reaching. Hume pushed the point further, noting that a person can assemble an airtight chain of factual premises about the world, and still, at the very last step, be smuggling in an unstated value judgment that none of the preceding facts actually supplied, an error he thought philosophers made constantly without ever noticing the seam. The claim unsettled a long philosophical tradition that had placed reason at the very top of human faculties, and it remains one of the more disruptive ideas in the history of moral philosophy, precisely because it still describes, uncomfortably well, how moral judgments actually seem to arrive. Xian Zhha Ru S. opened one of his most influential books with a line that has outlived nearly everything else he wrote: "That man is born free and is everywhere in chains." His puzzle was not simply that society restricts people, which seemed obvious enough to anyone living inside one. It was why a creature born with that much natural freedom ends up so thoroughly bound by laws, customs, and the constant, quiet pressure of other people's expectations, and whether any version of that binding could ever count as legitimate rather than simply imposed. Rousseau did not conclude that society itself was the problem to be escaped. He asked a narrower, harder question: what kind of agreement between free people could a genuinely free person actually accept, without simply losing the freedom they started with in the process? He was writing in an era where most people simply inherited their place, a subject born to a subject, a noble born to a noble, and treated that arrangement as though it were as natural and unquestionable as the weather. Rousseau's contribution was to insist that it was not natural at all, that it was built piece by piece, by human decisions that could in principle have gone differently, and that anything built by human decision could, at least in theory, be examined and rebuilt. His answer involved a kind of collective agreement in which people gave up certain individual freedoms in exchange for a shared, common freedom secured by the group as a whole, rather than surrendering to a ruler who owed them nothing in return. Whether Rousseau believed this arrangement was ever fully achieved in any actual society remains debated among his readers. What is clearer is the tension he named at the very start: born free, living in chains, which keeps getting rediscovered by every generation that inherits rules it never personally agreed to and has to decide, for itself, which of those rules still deserve to hold. Voltaire spent years publicly fighting to overturn the wrongful execution of a man named Jahan Kala, a Protestant merchant convicted, after a rushed and clearly prejudiced trial, of murdering his own son to prevent a supposed conversion to Catholicism. Voltaire had no personal connection to Calas or his family when the case first reached him. What drew him in was the sheer thinness of the evidence and the speed with which an entire city seemed to have convicted a man on rumour and religious suspicion, rather than proof. He spent years afterward gathering testimony, funding legal appeals, and writing pamphlet after pamphlet aimed at reopening a case most of France considered already settled. The campaign was slow, expensive, and unpopular in exactly the circles whose approval Voltaire usually depended on. He kept at it anyway, treating the case as a demonstration of something larger than one family's tragedy, that a verdict reached through prejudice and haste does not become true simply because a court, a city, or a majority of onlookers accepted it. The conviction was eventually overturned, years after Calas himself had already been executed. Too late to save the man, but not too late to clear his name and compensate his family. Voltaire had, by this point in his life, already made and spent a considerable fortune, and he used a share of it directly to fund the investigation, hiring people to track down witnesses and retrieve documents a poorer campaigner could never have afforded to chase. He treated his own success less as something to enjoy quietly and more as leverage, worth spending on a stranger's case precisely because he had it, and most people fighting similar injustices did not. Voltaire is remembered mostly for his wit and his relentless crusading against religious dogmatism in the abstract. The Calas case shows what that crusade actually looked like in practice: years of unglamorous, patient work fighting a specific injustice most people had already decided to stop thinking about. Before writing the book that made him famous for describing self-interest and the workings of markets, Adam Smith wrote an entirely different book, one arguing that morality itself comes from imagining how an impartial observer would judge our own actions. He called this imagined observer the impartial spectator, a kind of internal witness nearly everyone consults, often without noticing they are doing it, before acting in front of other people. Before losing our temper, before cutting a corner, before claiming credit that is not fully ours, something in most people quietly checks how a fair-minded stranger, watching closely, would judge the choice. Smith considered this instinct, not simple calculation of advantage, the real foundation underneath everyday morality. This earlier book complicates the popular shorthand version of Smith, the philosopher of pure self-interest and invisible market forces. He clearly considered natural sympathy for other people and a genuine desire to be seen as fair by an impartial judge, every bit as fundamental to human behavior as the pursuit of personal gain he later became famous for describing. The two books were never meant to contradict each other. Self-interest, in his fuller account, operates inside a person who also, simultaneously, cares what a fair observer would think of them. Smith spent decades revising this earlier book across multiple editions throughout his life, returning to it even after his economic writing had made him famous across Europe, a sign of how central he considered the argument to be, rather than an early idea he had simply outgrown. Later readers who only encountered his more famous economic writing sometimes missed this earlier half entirely, flattening a genuinely two-sided thinker into a spokesman for self-interest alone. The spectator watching from inside, quietly checking our own fairness before we act, was there in his thinking the entire time, well before the markets ever entered the conversation. If Immanuel Kant NT proposed a single test for whether an action is genuinely moral, ask whether you could will the rule behind that action to become a universal law, followed by absolutely everyone, without exception. The test is a way of catching a very specific and very common move people make without noticing they are making it, wanting an exception carved out just for themselves. A lie only works reliably, for instance, in a world where most people are still telling the truth most of the time. Ask whether the rule behind the lie, everyone may lie whenever it is convenient, could actually function as a universal law, and the answer collapses almost immediately, since a world of universal convenient lying makes lying itself useless as a strategy. Kant built an entire moral philosophy around this test, arguing that duty, doing the right thing because it is right, mattered more than doing something because of its likely outcome or personal benefit. This made his ethics considerably more demanding than one built around simply producing good results, since a person could not excuse a bad rule just because it happened to work out favorably this one time. Kant drew a sharp line between acting from duty and merely acting in a way that happens to look dutiful, arguing that a shopkeeper who charges honest prices purely to protect his reputation has not really acted morally at all, however useful the honesty might be, since the same convenient reputation could just as easily have justified cheating a customer who would never find out. He was famously disciplined in his own daily habits, structuring his days with enough regularity that neighbors in his hometown were said to set their schedules by his afternoon walks. Whether or not every detail of that reputation is precisely accurate, it fits a thinker whose entire philosophy was built on the idea that a rule worth following has to hold up consistently, applied the exact same way every single time, with no quiet exception reserved for yourself. Mary Wollstonecraft argued that if women in her era appeared less rational than men, the cause was a lack of education and opportunity, not any real difference in nature between the two. Writing at a time when women's minds were widely assumed, almost as settled fact, to be naturally weaker or less suited to serious reasoning, Wollstonecraft turned the argument directly around. Deny any group serious education for long enough, restrict their reading, discourage their curiosity, and of course they will eventually seem less capable, regardless of what they were actually born with the capacity to become. The apparent difference, in her account, was manufactured by circumstance, then quietly mistaken for something inborn and permanent. Her case rested heavily on reason itself, the same faculty Enlightenment thinkers of her era prized as the defining feature of a fully developed human mind. She argued that this same rational capacity, celebrated so consistently in men, had simply never been cultivated in women by design, through generations of limited schooling and constant social pressure toward ornamental accomplishment rather than genuine thought. She was particularly scornful of an education aimed only at making a woman pleasing and decorative, arguing that a mind trained purely for charm rather than for reasoning would naturally seem weaker in exactly the areas it had never been asked to develop, and that this was proof of the training's failure rather than proof of any real fixed limit on what a woman's mind could do. The book was considered provocative enough in its moment that some critics dismissed it, and its author, rather than engage with the argument directly. Wollstonecraft's underlying claim was narrower and harder to dismiss than her critics suggested, that an assumed natural limit, examined closely, often turns out to be a manufactured one, built by generations of denied opportunity rather than by nature at all. Ralph Waldo Emerson told his readers that to recognize your own private thought as true for everyone else too is the very definition of genius, since most people talk themselves out of their best ideas the moment someone else disagrees with them. His argument was not that every private thought deserves to be trusted blindly. It was that the instinctive move most people make when an original idea meets resistance, quietly discounting their own perception and deferring instead to the more confident opinion in the room, is a habit worth noticing and resisting. Emerson considered this a kind of quiet cowardice rather than simple politeness, a habit of trading your own judgment for social comfort, without even registering that a trade had happened. He was not arguing for stubbornness or contrarianism for its own sake. The harder discipline he described was noticing the exact moment an original thought arrives, distinguishing it from mere reflex or borrowed opinion, and then having the nerve to hold on to it once social pressure starts pushing back. Most people, in his observation, encounter their own best insight and dismiss it as too obvious or too strange to matter, only to see the same idea praised later once someone else says it with more confidence. He pushed the point uncomfortably far, arguing that even the wisest people mostly recognize in a stranger's finished work nothing more than their own rejected thoughts handed back to them, dressed up with the confidence they themselves had lacked in the moment they first had the same idea. Emerson delivered this argument at a moment in American life when conformity to inherited European ideas and imported cultural authority was still the unquestioned default in most educated circles. Trusting your own mind, in his account, was not arrogance, it was simply refusing to abandon a genuine thought purely because the room disagreed. Henry David Thoreau moved into a small cabin beside Walden Pond for a little over 2 years, wanting, in his own words, to live deliberately and see what living actually had to teach him, stripped down to its essentials. His experiment was not really about isolation for its own sake, and he was closer to the town of Concord and to visitors than the popular image of total wilderness solitude usually suggests. What he was actually testing was simpler, which of his daily needs were genuine, and which were simply habits absorbed uncritically from everyone around him, expectations about work, comfort, and possession that had never really been examined. He tracked his own expenses, his food, his hours of labor, with the same close attention most people reserve for scrutinizing someone else's business, and found that the actual necessities of a functioning life took up far less time and money than the surrounding culture seemed to assume. The rest of the day, freed up by this reduction, he spent observing, reading, and thinking, treating ordinary daily living itself as a kind of research project worth taking seriously. He recorded, almost obsessively, the exact cost of his cabin's boards and nails down to the last cent, less out of frugality for its own sake than to make visible, in plain numbers, just how small the gap actually was between what people assumed they needed and what a functioning life genuinely required. Thoreau was not arguing that everyone should abandon society and build a cabin in the woods. He was arguing something narrower and more transferable, that most people never actually test which of their obligations are necessary and which are simply inherited assumption because they never step back far enough to look. 2 years beside a pond gave him exactly that distance, and what he found, once the noise of convention was mostly removed, was considerably quieter than he expected. John Stuart Mill suffered a severe mental breakdown in his early 20s, following an unusually intense upbringing in which his father had trained him to reason like an adult from early childhood, drilling him in logic, economics, and classical languages years ahead of his peers. By his own account, this rigorous education produced a formidable analytical mind, but left something essential underdeveloped. In his early 20s, Mill found himself asking a plain question: whether achieving all his intellectual goals would actually make him happy, and the honest answer that arrived was no, followed by a collapse severe enough that he described losing, for a time, any real reason to keep going. What pulled him back, by his own account, was not more logic. It was poetry, encountered almost by accident during his recovery, which let him feel something directly rather than merely analyze it from a distance. The experience convinced him that pure reason, however powerful, could not on its own supply a reason to live, and that feeling deserved a place in a well-lived life that his earlier education had never made room for. He later described the specific poem that moved him during recovery almost apologetically, aware it was not a particularly sophisticated piece of writing by the standards he had been trained in, which only underlined his point further, that the value of the experience had nothing to do with intellectual difficulty and everything to do with genuinely feeling something after years of only analyzing. This crisis reshaped the philosophy he later became known for. His writing on liberty and utility carries a warmth and attention to individual feeling that a purely rationalist upbringing might never have produced on its own. Mill's most famous ideas, the harm principle chief among them, emerged not from an unbroken chain of pure logic, but from a mind that had cracked once, badly, and rebuilt itself with room left over, for something logic alone had never been able to supply. Charles Darwin held on to his theory of evolution by natural selection for roughly 20 years, quietly gathering supporting evidence from barnacles, pigeon breeders, and decades of careful correspondence, before another naturalist's letter finally pushed him to publish. He understood exactly how disruptive the idea would be, both to religious belief and to his own standing among the scientific and social circles he depended on, and he seems to have responded to that pressure, not by rushing to claim credit, but by slowing down even further, building a case so thorough it would be difficult to dismiss outright. 2 decades passed this way, Darwin collecting, testing, and quietly refining, telling only a small circle of trusted colleagues what he was actually working on. During those same years, he bred pigeons in his own garden specifically to observe how quickly artificial selection could reshape a species when a breeder simply chose which birds got to reproduce, treating his own backyard as a kind of controlled rehearsal for the much slower, unchosen version of the same process he believed was shaping every living thing in the wild. That patience nearly cost him the credit entirely. In 1858, a letter arrived from Alfred Russel Wallace, a naturalist working independently in the field, describing a theory of natural selection strikingly similar to the one Darwin had been sitting on for 20 years without publishing. Colleagues arranged for both men's work to be presented together, and Darwin, prompted at last, moved quickly to finish and publish On the Origin of Species the following year. The near miss says something about the cost of extreme caution alongside its obvious benefits. Darwin's patience produced an unusually well-supported theory. It also came within one letter of costing him sole credit for the idea most associated with his name today. Søren Kierkegaard described anxiety not as a flaw to eliminate or a symptom to medicate away, but as the dizzying feeling of standing directly in front of your own freedom to choose. For Kierkegaard, the discomfort many people try to numb, explain away, or blame entirely on outside circumstances is often a sign of something quite real. The vertigo of realizing that you could choose differently right now, that no one else can make the choice for you, and that once the choice is made, you alone will have to live inside its consequences. He considered this dizziness a kind of proof of freedom rather than evidence that something has gone wrong. He argued that a life of genuine meaning cannot be reached through certainty alone, since certainty of the kind people crave before committing to anything important rarely arrives in time. Instead, meaning requires a leap, commitment made without the complete proof a person might prefer to have first, precisely because waiting for that proof indefinitely is itself a kind of choice, just a passive one. He compared the feeling to standing at the edge of a high slice and looking down, where part of the dread comes from the height itself, and part of it, stranger and harder to admit, comes from a dim awareness of your own freedom to jump, a possibility that was never actually likely, but that the mind cannot quite stop registering once it has been noticed. Kierkegaard wrote from personal experience with this discomfort, breaking off his own engagement in a decision he wrestled with publicly across several of his books, treating his private anxiety as material worth examining rather than hiding. The anxiety, in his account, never fully disappears once you understand it correctly. It simply stops being mistaken for a malfunction and starts being recognized for what it actually is, the unavoidable weight of a genuinely free choice. Friedrich Nietzsche, who lived with severe and lasting illness for most of his adult life, migraines, digestive collapse, near blindness at times, coined a phrase, love of fate, for the practice of wanting nothing in your life to have happened differently, not even the suffering. This was not passive resignation, the shrug of someone who has simply given up resisting. Nietzsche described something closer to a dare, looking back honestly at every hardship, every wrong turn, every stretch of suffering, and affirming all of it as genuinely necessary to becoming the person you actually are, rather than treating it as a regrettable detour from some better version of your life that never happened. Wishing any piece of it away, in his account, meant wishing away part of yourself along with it. His own body gave this idea an uncomfortable weight it might otherwise have lacked. This was not a philosophy composed from comfort or good health. Nietzsche wrote much of his major work while in near-constant physical pain, frequently unable to work for more than a few hours before his condition forced him to stop. And the demand to affirm all of it, illness included, reads very differently once that context is visible. Friends and correspondents who visited him during his healthier stretches described a man notably gentle and courteous in person, a detail that sits oddly against the more provocative, combative tone of his published writing. And that suggests the philosophy of relentless affirmation may have been at least partly a discipline he was actively practicing on himself rather than a temperament he simply already had. He extended the idea into a thought experiment, asking whether you could face the prospect of living your exact life over again, every joy and every suffering an infinite number of times, and still call it worth living. Amor fati was his answer to that test, not because the suffering stopped mattering, but because he had decided deliberately that it belonged to him too. Leo Tolstoy wrote two of the most celebrated novels in history, reached extraordinary fame and wealth by his 50s, and then fell into a crisis so severe he later wrote about removing certain objects from his own home out of caution, not trusting his own state of mind. With everything the world seemed to offer already in hand, wealth, family, artistic achievement recognized across Europe, Tolstoy found himself asking what any of it had actually been for, and no answer he had previously trusted held up under the question. He described the feeling as a kind of arrest in the middle of living, a sudden inability to see the point of continuing along the path that had, by every external measure, already succeeded. Rather than staying stuck there, he spent years searching deliberately, through philosophy, through organized religion, through long conversations with the peasants who worked his land, people whose lives looked far harder than his own, but who seemed, to him, to carry a settled faith he no longer had. He was looking less for an argument than for a reason sturdy enough to keep going that his earlier success had never actually provided. What struck him most, by his own account, was that the people around him with the least material comfort, the peasants who could neither read his novels nor cared much who he was, seemed to face death and hardship with a settled calm that his own celebrated intellect had never managed to produce for him. The search eventually led him toward a simpler, more radical faith, and a lifestyle stripped of much of the wealth and status he had spent decades accumulating. The item that matters here was never the specific religious answer he landed on. It was the plainer discovery underneath it. That total worldly success achieved exactly as planned is not the same thing as having a reason to keep living, and Tolstoy needed to find that reason somewhere else entirely. William James, one of the founders of modern psychology, proposed something that ran against ordinary common sense, that feelings do not only cause our actions, since deliberately acting a certain way can itself produce the feeling. Common sense says a person trembles because they are afraid, and runs because they are afraid. James suggested the sequence could just as easily work the other way, that the trembling and the running come first, and the feeling of fear follows from noticing your own body already behaving that way. Stranger still, he argued the same mechanism could be used deliberately, adopting the posture, expression, and behavior of confidence, even without feeling any yet, tends to generate a real measure of that confidence afterward, rather than the confidence needing to arrive first. This became one of the earliest scientific arguments that emotion and behavior are far more tangled together than a simple, one-directional chain of cause and effect. It suggested that a person waiting passively to feel differently before acting differently might have the order backwards, and that action itself can be the more reliable lever available. He was careful to note this was not a complete substitute for genuine feeling, more a lever that could be pulled deliberately on the harder days, when waiting passively for motivation or courage to arrive first simply was not producing results, and doing the smaller physical version of the feeling first was the only available way to get the day moving at all. James carried the same practical instinct into his broader philosophy, known as pragmatism, which judged ideas less by how elegant they sounded in the abstract, and more by what they actually produced when applied to a real life. An idea that worked in his account deserved more trust than an idea that merely sounded correct. Acting your way into a feeling was, in miniature, pragmatism applied to a single afternoon rather than to an entire worldview. Marie Curie won 2 Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences, physics and chemistry, and she achieved the second one while raising 2 young daughters largely alone, several years after her research partner and husband, Pierre, died suddenly in a street accident in Paris. Grief did not pause her research so much as run alongside it. She continued the painstaking, physically demanding work of isolating radioactive elements from tons of raw ore, work that required enormous patience and precision, while also managing a household and the daily needs of 2 children by herself. Colleagues who worked alongside her during this period described someone who seemed to disappear entirely into the problem in front of her, hours passing without apparent notice of anything else happening around her. Her drive seemed to come from something closer to devotion to the questions themselves than to ambition in any ordinary sense. Recognition and prizes appeared to matter far less to her than the actual measurements and results sitting in front of her at any given moment. She kept working through a period that would have given almost anyone reason to stop entirely, not because grief was absent, but because the work itself seemed to offer a place to stand, while everything else in her life had become unsteady. She was, at the time, the first woman ever to hold a professorship at the university where her husband had taught, a position she took over specifically to continue the research the 2 of them had built together. Delivering her first lecture without any public mention of her own grief, addressing only the science exactly where his own final lecture had left off, Marie Curie's sustained, unglamorous persistence, kept up across repeated personal loss and considerable physical hardship, produced 2 of the most significant scientific careers ever recorded under a single name. Alan Turing was troubled by a question that seemed to resist any clean answer: whether a machine could truly think. Philosophers had argued over definitions of thought for centuries without resolving much of anything, and Turing suspected the argument itself might simply be unwinnable as framed. So instead of trying to define thought directly, he proposed a practical substitute. Have a human judge hold a written conversation with 2 hidden participants, 1 human and 1 machine, and see whether the judge could reliably tell which was which. If a machine could carry on this exchange convincingly enough that a human judge could not consistently distinguish it from an actual person, Turing argued, it deserved to be treated, for practical purposes, as though it were thinking, regardless of what was happening mechanically underneath. This sidestep let a stalled philosophical argument become something that could actually be tested and discussed concretely, rather than debated forever in the abstract. Turing had already shown a similar instinct for reframing an unanswerable problem into a workable one during the war, where his code-breaking work turned an overwhelming, seemingly impossible task into a series of narrower, solvable mechanical steps. Rather than trying to break an encryption system through some singular flash of insight, Turing helped design a machine that could mechanically work through the vast space of possibilities far faster than any team of people alone, again choosing a testable, narrower process over an approach that depended on inspiration arriving on demand. The imitation game, as he called it, did not settle the deeper philosophical question of what thought actually is, and Turing likely knew it would not. What it offered instead was a way to keep working productively on a hard problem without first waiting for an answer to an even harder one that may never fully arrive. When Hannah Arendt observed the trial of a Nazi bureaucrat responsible for organizing mass deportations during the Second World War, what struck her most was how ordinary and unremarkable he seemed in person, rather than how monstrous. Arendt had expected, like most observers following the trial, to encounter something recognizably evil in his manner, a visible cruelty or hatred that would explain the scale of what he had helped carry out. Instead, she found a man who spoke largely in bureaucratic clichés, focused on paperwork, procedure, and career advancement, who appeared to have simply stopped asking what his job actually meant for the people on the other end of it. Her resulting argument, that a kind of thoughtlessness, rather than open malice, can enable enormous harm when it operates inside a system built to carry that harm out efficiently, was deeply controversial at the time. It was controversial partly because it removed the comfort of an obvious monster to point to, replacing it with something closer and more uncomfortable, an ordinary capacity for not thinking too hard about consequences, dressed up in the routine language of doing one's job. She noted that he repeatedly described his own actions using stock phrases and bureaucratic language rather than his own words, as though he had genuinely stopped being able to think outside the set vocabulary his role had handed him, a detail Arendt considered more chilling than any display of open hatred would have been. Arendt was careful to distinguish this observation from an excuse. Recognizing that evil can wear an unremarkable face did not, in her account, reduce the responsibility of the person wearing it. It only changed where people needed to look for the warning signs, away from obvious cruelty and toward the quieter, more common failure of simply refusing to think. Simon de Beauvoir opened a landmark work of philosophy with a claim that has been debated and quoted ever since, that one is not born a woman but becomes one. Her argument separated biological fact from social expectation with unusual precision for its time. Much of what a given culture treats as natural femininity, she argued, gentleness, passivity, a preoccupation with appearance, is not written into the body at birth, but learned gradually, absorbed from the roles a person is handed from early childhood onward, reinforced constantly enough that it eventually feels indistinguishable from instinct. This reframing had consequences well beyond her original subject. If identity of this kind is built through experience rather than fixed permanently at birth, then it can also, at least in principle, be examined, questioned, and reshaped, rather than simply accepted as an unchangeable given. De Beauvoir was careful not to claim that biology was irrelevant entirely. Her point was narrower, and in some ways, more disruptive, that a great deal of what gets treated as fixed nature is actually an ongoing social process, still happening, still being reinforced daily, rather than a settled fact decided once at birth. She wrote the book partly out of her own puzzlement at being asked, repeatedly, to explain her own experience as a woman before being taken seriously as a philosopher in her own right. A request, she noted, was rarely made of the men working alongside her in the same circles, doing broadly similar work. The claim reached well beyond her original subject and reshaped how later thinkers approached questions of identity of every kind, not only gender. De Beauvoir's central insight, that becoming is an active, ongoing process rather than a static inheritance, outlived the specific post-war debates it was written into. Albert Einstein said his major breakthroughs came less from formal calculation than from what he called combinatory play, turning an idea over as an image or a private game long before he ever attempted to prove anything about it. One of his earliest and most famous thought experiments involved simply picturing what it would look like to travel alongside a beam of light, watching it the way you might watch a train from a platform. He returned to this image repeatedly as a teenager, years before the physics existed, to properly answer the question it raised, carrying it around not as an unsolved homework problem, but as something closer to a private curiosity he kept returning to for its own sake. Einstein treated this kind of unhurried, half-playful imagining as a genuine and necessary stage of real scientific work, not a distraction from the actual thinking. He described his own process as often visual and intuitive, well before it became mathematical. Images and sensations he would only later translate into equations once the underlying idea had settled into something clear enough to formalize. Formal proof, in his account, tended to arrive last, confirming an intuition that had already been living, half-formed, in his imagination for years. He described his own thinking as proceeding largely through pictures and bodily sensations rather than words, translating those images into precise mathematical language only once the underlying shape of the idea felt settled enough in his own mind to survive the translation. The patience this required is easy to underestimate. An idea held loosely, without pressure to resolve it immediately, was allowed to keep developing quietly in the background for years at a time. Some of the most consequential equations in the history of physics began, by Einstein's own description, as nothing more organized than a teenager wondering what riding alongside a beam of light might actually look like. The ancient Indian strategist and philosopher Chu Nuk Yu is remembered for insisting that before undertaking any endeavor, a person should stop and ask 3 specific questions. Why am I doing this? What results do I actually expect? And will I succeed? As mentor and advisor to Chandragupta Maurya, the founder of one of ancient India's largest empires, Chanukya treated statecraft as something far too consequential for improvisation, insisting that even the most powerful people in his court prepare deliberately and question their own motives before committing to a course of action. His writings on governance and strategy assumed that most failures were decided at the planning stage, long before any actual difficulty appeared, in exactly the moments when a leader skipped these basic questions out of impatience or overconfidence. The 3 questions scale down easily from running an empire to something as ordinary as starting a new project, accepting a role, or making a difficult personal decision. Asking why forces a person to name the actual motive behind an action, rather than simply assuming it is obvious. Asking what results are expected forces some clarity about what success would even look like. Asking whether success is likely forces an honest reckoning with the odds, rather than blind optimism carrying the plan forward on its own. His broader writings on governance extend the same caution to the ruler's own advisors and household, arguing that a leader who never questions the people closest to him is exposed in exactly the place a more careful person would have checked first. Ch Nuk Yu's own career, advising the construction of an empire that would eventually stretch across most of the Indian subcontinent, suggests he applied this discipline seriously himself, pausing to interrogate his own motives and plans well before committing either his own reputation or his ruler's resources to them. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in Maryland, and he later wrote that the moment he understood reading could unlock his own freedom, his path in life became impossible to reverse. He first learned his letters from the wife of the man who enslaved him, a woman who began teaching him almost as an act of simple kindness, until her husband discovered it and forbade the lessons outright, insisting that literacy would make an enslaved person unmanageable, discontented, and dangerous to control. Douglass later described that reaction, meant to shut the door entirely, as the moment he understood exactly how much power reading actually held. If his enslavers feared it this much, he reasoned, it had to be worth pursuing at almost any cost. He continued in secret afterward, trading bread with hungry white children in the neighborhood, in exchange for reading lessons, piecing together literacy from scraps of newspaper, spelling books, and whatever printed material he could get his hands on without being caught. Each new word functioned as a small, private act of defiance against a system explicitly built to keep him from ever having exactly this tool. That stolen education eventually gave him the means to plan and carry out his own escape, and afterward the vocabulary and confidence to write and speak publicly against the system he had escaped, becoming one of the most powerful abolitionist orators and writers of his century. His own autobiography, written and published under his real name at real personal risk, stands as direct evidence of exactly what his enslavers had been afraid literacy would produce. He later reflected that the very anger he felt at being denied an education became, once redirected, part of what carried him through the actual work of learning in secret, evidence turned back against the people who had tried hardest to withhold it. An act meant to be permanently forbidden became, instead, the foundation of an entire life spent afterward in the open, arguing for the freedom of everyone still denied it. Viktor Frankl was a practicing psychiatrist in Vienna when he was deported, along with his family, to Nazi concentration camps during the Second World War. He survived multiple camps across several years, an ordeal that killed both of his parents, his brother and his wife. What Frankl noticed, watching thousands of prisoners endure conditions designed to strip away every shred of dignity and hope, was that physical strength alone did not reliably predict who survived. Prisoners who seemed physically robust sometimes gave up entirely within days once they lost any sense of a reason to keep going. Others, considerably weaker in body, endured far longer, and the difference, as best Frankl could observe it, seemed to trace back to whether a person still had something to hold on to, a person waiting for them, unfinished work left undone, a reason that made the suffering feel like it was leading somewhere, rather than nowhere at all. He carried this observation out of the camps and built an entire school of psychology around it afterward, arguing that the primary drive underneath human behavior is not pleasure and not power, but a search for meaning, something a person can hold on to even when almost everything else, comfort, dignity, freedom, has already been taken away. Meaning, in his account, was not something circumstances handed a person. It was something a person could still choose to construct, even inside circumstances that offered nothing else at all. Frankl wrote his account quickly after liberation, treating it less as a memoir to be dwelled on and more as a case study, evidence gathered under the most extreme conditions imaginable for a claim he considered genuinely universal. A reason to keep going, once found, could outlast almost anything done to take it away. 50 lessons worked out across roughly 2,500 years, by emperors and slaves, doubters and believers, keep circling back to some version of the same quiet claim, that how a person meets what happens to them still matters, and still can be chosen even now. 50 people, across roughly 2,500 years, most of whom never met, never read each other, and often never even spoke the same language, kept arriving at strikingly similar conclusions from wildly different starting points. An emperor writing to himself in a war tent, and an enslaved teacher instructing the sons of his own oppressors, landed on nearly the same idea about where control actually lives. A merchant ruined by a shipwreck and a psychiatrist who survived a concentration camp both discovered that meaning, once found, can outlast almost anything done to take it away. None of them were writing for you specifically. Marcus Aurelius never expected his notebook to survive the week, let alone 2,000 years. Frederick Douglass was not thinking about a listener centuries later when he traded bread for reading lessons in secret. And yet here they all are, still working, still oddly specific to whatever you happen to be carrying today. That is the quiet claim underneath everything in this episode, a very long, slow process of human beings working out how to live, running for as long as anyone has kept a record of it, and a much faster, much smaller process happening right now, in an ordinary day, in an ordinary decision you are about to make, without necessarily noticing you are making it. The first process has already handed you 50 small, tested answers. What you do with any of them is still entirely up to you. No single lesson here was meant to fix everything. Most of these thinkers would probably have found that idea a little absurd. What they offer instead is company, a long line of people who faced something difficult and worked out, carefully, sometimes at real cost to themselves, a way through it that still holds up when tested against a life lived centuries later. That is generally how it goes with the truly durable ideas. They rarely announce themselves. They simply keep being true, quietly, long after the person who first said them is gone.